Hi, my name is Emilio. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Career Development Office. So today I'm going to be talking to you on how to write an effective CV. How do you really bring that document to life? Now, some questions that are probably coming to your mind is, well, what is a CV? What's the difference between a CV and a resume? What's the purpose of a CV? And what should I include? And should I have the same CV for all my applications? Well, luckily I got the answers for you. CVs and resumes, they're very similar, but when it comes to format, they're the same. Content, on the other hand, is where they differentiate. A CV is much more comprehensive than a resume. So when a resume usually sticks to 1 to 2 pages, a CV goes way beyond that. It could be anywhere from 2 to 3 to even 5 pages. It's all about making sure that that information is relevant. Now, CVs are also more commonly used in academia, research, or in healthcare professions. So we're going to provide some guidance on how to write that. Now, don't confuse a CV with an international CV, as a lot of times internationally, they use CV interchangeably with resumes, as opposed to here in the States where we refer to a CV as a much more comprehensive resume. Now, the 3 basics of a CV. The format, so how are you organizing your information? The content, what are you including? Anywhere from your clinical rotations, to your community involvement, to even leadership roles that you've held throughout this opportunity. We're going to be going through various sections, anywhere from your research to hands-on experiences in the field, and provide you some guidance on how to organize it. And then style. You know, as much as this is a document that showcases what you've done, it's also a marketing tool. So we're going to be using a lot of styling in terms of bolding, italicizing, or even underlining to really highlight key points and draw in the eyes of the person that's reading your document. So we're going to be going into some tips and providing some guidance on little examples from each one of these sections. Other tips on formatting. So you want to ensure that your document is organized in reverse chronological order. So it's not a Quentin Tarantino movie, so you want to start with your most recent experience and then working backwards from there. Also, you want to make sure that you're consistent with your font style. So if you use Times Roman or a Calibri or whichever font style you use, make sure that you stay consistent throughout the whole document. Also, you want to ensure that you're not going any lower than a 10-point font size. So usually you go anywhere from 10 to 12. I'm going to provide some guidance on how to make your name stand out, which would be a little bit in a larger font, but pretty much you want to stay consistent with each aspect. And then being very strategic with our bolding and our italicizing. You're going to see that we're going to be strategic in terms of what do I want the employer to see and how can I make the document really aesthetically pleasing for them. So now some tips on how to style your CV, some do's and don'ts. One of the do's is creating your own letterhead and making sure that the way that you organize that letterhead, which is your contact information, is consistent with your cover letter and other documents. You want to make sure that it's organized the same way, has a nice look to it. Also, making sure that your name is bolded and in a much larger font than anything else. These are one of the few times that the font size might be a little bit different, but you really want your name to stand out in there. Now, also you want to make sure that you're being very strategic with bolding, italicizing, and underlining. You know, if you bold something on a document, right away that reader's eyes are going to be drawn right into it. On the other side of the spectrum, if you overbold, then nothing's really standing out. So throughout this whole presentation, I'm going to be going through different slides, different examples that really showcase how to be strategic with all of those styling techniques. Now, printing on one side of the paper, so specifically if you're turning this document in specifically to that employer, you want to make sure that it's printed on one side. Although we want to go green, we still want it to be aesthetically pleasing for that individual. And unlike Elle Woods' Legally Blonde, where they have a pink resume with some perfume on it, although we want to use high quality resume paper, we want to use a more traditional white or ivory scale for that type of example. So making sure that you're consistent with all those pieces. And some don'ts. Now, don't overcrowd your information, so don't put too much of these experiences that they're wondering, well, why am I reading this? So we're going to be very strategic as to what we're including and is it relevant for the reader? And then how are we styling this document, whether it's the bolding, italicizing, underlining, and the organization of everything. And so one of the last things on the don'ts is overusing I or using I. In our CV, we're not allowed to use the words I, my, and me. So throughout my presentation, I'm going to be going into how to use action verbs that help you avoid using those more commonly used questions in terms of I, my, and me to start the statements. Now your contact information. So I was mentioning before, the font size and how to organize it. So you're seeing right now a great example. You know, you have John Travolta and Johnny Karate, each one organized in different ways, but you're seeing how their name is bolded in a much larger font size, and then everything else is right underneath or organized in a certain way, is keeping consistent with the rest of the document. So if your name's at an 18-point font size, the rest of the document's at 11, keep that contact information, including your address, your email, and phone number in that font size. Also, if you're about to graduate or enter the work field, although you might be more used to using your educational email, your .edu, you're getting ready for the workforce. So you may want to develop a nice professional email, your first and last name at gmail.com, to put on this document, because as you start going in the job search or going into opportunities, you want to make sure that they see that brand for yourself that you're creating. Now, one of the other sections, one of the main sections you're going to have is your education. So how do we organize this? One key tip is for all of your section headings, instead of putting them in bold or in much larger font size, just put them in all capital letters and underline. So that way, it's not what the employee's eyes are solely going to be focused on, but it's more like a guide point. And as I've been mentioning before, you could be much more strategic with the bolding when you do use it. So in this section in our education, we went ahead and bolded our degree. So the first one we have is the Doctorate of Science in Physical Therapy, because that's what we want them to see. A lot of times that degree is the first checkpoint to even be eligible for this opportunity. So we went ahead and bolded it. Now all the way in the right-hand side, we put the graduation dates. You don't have to put the full range of when you've been in school, just put the anticipated or the actual graduation date. Now, underneath the degree, our secondary information, we can go ahead and italicize the institution. So we go ahead and put Nova Southeastern University in italics, and even put the acronym for NSU so you could refer back to it that way. And then on the right-hand side of that, right underneath the dates, you put the location. Now, this is very key because the way that you organize this, you just made it very easy for whoever's reading your document to just move left to right, left to right. So he's pretty much figured out, okay, now this is how I could read the document from now on. And that's what we're going to do. The easier it is for them to read it, the more likely they're going to read more. So you're going to see that consistency go on as we go through each section together. So now some potential headings. We're going to give a lot of different examples on these, but here's just a few examples of what you could put on your document as some section headings. Now, summary of qualifications. This is one that we see very often, but in reality, it's not always necessary. If you're an individual that, let's say, has been working in the field for 10 plus years and are now making some sort of transition, we may want to include it. Or if you had prior experiences, maybe internationally, let's say you got involved in dentistry internationally and now you're coming back to the States and have been working towards your doctorate degree here, we definitely want to include some information within there. But it's not for everyone, so if you're graduating a program and you maybe have had experience in the past in other areas, but not in the area you're going into, you not necessarily need a summary of qualifications. Now, some other headings, you have publications and presentations, and we do have some samples on these on how to organize it, but usually you want to organize those in either APA or MLA style, depending on what your program is. And if you're not sure on how to do those references, I'm going to have some examples to really help you out with that. Organizations and research. Now, if you're in your professional affiliations, we're going to list them. Now, if you held a more active role, we might organize it in a different section indicated in leadership experiences. Now, your research. This is a section specifically in CVs that are very common, but there's a lot of different ways of organizing it, especially if you have some research that has some really long titles or is very in-depth and you held multiple projects within there. So we have multiple ways of really organizing that. Clinical experiences, and I'm going to talk a lot about that because that's something very important within your field and really gives you a chance or an avenue to showcase those clinical skills or those skills directly into your field that you've now developed through school. Relevant projects, so if you've done something outside of the classroom, you took the initiative on something, took a leadership role, no matter what type of project it is, there's many ways of organizing it. You don't want to cut yourself short. So a lot of these even titles or headings we're giving you to today, it could change. Each of us have individual experiences, and we're going to find a very strong way to really market that out to that reader. Awards, also community involvement. So if you participated in the Special Olympics, a Day for Children, we're going to really showcase on how to provide that on your CV and organize it in a way that they show what role you played within that community involvement. Now, besides everything you've done hands-on, also shadowing opportunities or things that you've done in terms of your actual interest and hobbies. You know, this is your CV. Unlike in your resume, you can't really talk about your hobbies and interests. The CV has allowed you to give you an avenue to be able to talk about such things. And specifically, if you're applying to programs like residency, they really do want to know what you do outside of the typical work environment. Now, relevant experiences. So this is something that's going to go for all of the sections we'll be talking about. You want to use strong targeted headings. You don't want to just put everything under work experience, because that's not really telling me anything. You know, when they read that section headings, it should help me jump to conclusions as the type of experiences you're going to be going into. So I mentioned clinical experiences, research, or even teaching and mentoring. So we're going to be going through a lot of these examples together, but pay attention to some key things I'm going to be talking about, including the use of action verbs within the bullet points, how they have a strategic order to the actual bullet points. So the most relevant, one of the first, and then moving down in terms of they're still relevant, but maybe not as strong as that first bullet point. And then this is something, optional, but you don't want to have periods at the end of your bullet points. They're not really complete sentences, so you don't really need a period at the end of them. Now, our first potential heading. So let's say that this applicant was going into public health and has a bunch of experience in public health, internships, field work. And so instead of putting that work experience, if I read that very quickly, work experience, I can't just jump into conclusions as to what this individual can bring to the table. Now, if I see something like public health experience, and I'm reading that and I need to bring someone in, my eyes already open up. I'm like, perfect, someone with experience. Let me read some more about this. Now, as you can see the way that we have this organized, in this section, this individual decided, well, I really wanted to see the organizations I've worked with, considering a lot of these opportunities I did in a student or internship capacity. So instead, in all of them, they bolded the actual participation or the event that they were a part of, or the employer. And on the right-hand side of that, we put the dates. Now, underneath that's keeping that same format we did for education, our secondary information, we're going to go ahead and put in italics what role we played. So we were an MPH student. Now, on the right-hand side of that, the actual location of where this occurred, West Palm Beach. And then you can see this individual started with some very strong bullet points. Research, developed, it's using a lot of action verbs, so it helps them avoid using the words I, my, and me. In our office, we call these PAR statements, and I'm going to have a slide where I explain what those components and what that acronym means. But I just want to provide you some guidance. As we go through these slides, really start paying attention to the skills and the attributes and the action verbs they're using. One thing that you should do before even writing this document is ask yourself, if I was the hiring manager for this opportunity, let's say you're the employer now, you're deciding who's going to get hired, what are the key skills, abilities, knowledge I would be looking for? Write that all down on a piece of note, because then when you go back to your CV and read it over for yourself, you're going to write a little check note next to all the skills that you already highlighted. Now, if you didn't highlight those skills, the next question should be, would you hire yourself if you had seen the CV like this? So it's a good practice, and it helps uncover what are the key things I need to mention in this document. So you saw in the last slide in terms of public health experience how we use a strong targeted heading. Now we're going to do the same thing for this example. And you can see we're doing this presentation so it caters to any individual with any background. But if you're going into healthcare and you have prior healthcare experience, no matter in what capacity, whether you're an EMT or a healthcare volunteer for a hospital, you want to make sure to add that value to it. So you can see with this example, we started with what it was, healthcare experience. And we start off with what we thought was the most important information, our actual position. So we actually bolded that information, and same format that we did in the other sections, we put our section heading in all capital letters and underlined, so it's more like a guide point. Our position in bold, the dates all the way in the right-hand side. Now, right underneath what we have bolded is what we determine as the secondary information for this section. So we go ahead and put that in italics. Now, on the right-hand side of that, once again, our location. And then strong bullet points. It's very important. Try to think about what are you trying to showcase here? What skills you're trying to showcase here? Even if it might be a different area of healthcare where you're now applying to, think about those skills. If you did communication here and it's necessary for this next opportunity in healthcare, really showcase those skill sets. And you can see with this other example, this individual getting in teaching opportunities. Use those keywords because that really always showcase other skill sets. Someone that's done teaching, it already tells me they're a relationship builder, they can communicate, and they might be attentive to details. So some key skills you may want that reader to see in you. Now, clinical experiences. Now, the common question I get when I tell students, so how have you placed your clinical experiences on your CV? They're like, well, Mila, why would I put my clinical experiences? That's something that everyone in my class is doing, other individuals in medical school or all these different programs are doing. And that might be true. And I've actually done this. I've asked, all right, so I'll go ahead and ask 10 individuals who are all doing the same rotation. Tell me about your emergency unit rotation. Tell me about your public health fieldwork experience. And I guarantee you, and which has happened, I got 10 different responses and 10 different ways of taking it. Because the way we pick up on information, the way we communicate it, the way we internalize it is so very different. And also, besides your clinical experiences that you've had right now in the program, what other avenues would you be able to showcase that you have those clinical skills, that you have the knowledge needed in the field, that you've worked with patients, that you've done these hands-on roles as opposed to just the theory behind it? So it is a very necessary skill and a very necessary section that we need on our CV. Now, how do we organize it? Keeping the same format before, and you're probably already picking up on it. Mila, we get it, we know how to organize it. But that's already good because that reader's thinking the same thing. Oh, perfect, I don't need to figure out how to read this next section. It's not a puzzle for them. They're just continuously moving forward. So section headings in all capital letters and underline, and you can see the strategic use of bolding and italicizing. And once again, strong action verbs. Really make sure you've written down that list, all the skills and abilities needed in the field I'm going into. Because when you break anything down to the bare bones of skills, you start seeing how other things you've been involved in correlate with that thing that you're going after now. Now, some other opportunities, some of you, as you're in their program or as you've been kind of on your journey to reach your career goals, have had a lot of involvement. And you don't want to just cut yourself short and be like, well, they're not dealing with healthcare, so it's not needed. You know, the most successful doctors or individuals in healthcare aren't necessarily the ones with the strongest knowledge base, are the ones that have those transferable skills, making someone feel at ease, making feel someone trusts. You know, you still have to perform a procedure or provide information, but in the way that it's provided is very key as well. So if, let's say, you were a tutor or you worked in teaching roles, you still want to indicate that, and it shows a lot of different skills. Now, also, if you're in academia, like you're a current faculty member or you're going for opportunities in higher education, instead of just putting in under professional experience, let's put it on what it was, you know, teaching experience or teaching and research experience, especially if the faculty position you're going after involves some research components, if it's a research university. Keeping what we've been doing before, all capital letters and underline our section headings, and then bolding our actual position, which in this case we find is to be the most relevant, italicizing the employer that we work for, and dates and location constantly on the right-hand side with no styling. It's just a way of us being able to showcase that. But you can see we're being consistent now as we're going slide by slide through each one of these sections. So one thing is being part of a group or an organization. It's another thing if you got elected or you took an active role within that organization. So if you're a president for the organization, you don't want to just hide that. You want to put it into life. Also, have you ever heard of an organization say, I'm not really looking for leaders, don't worry about it? No, of course not. Everyone wants leaders. It's a valuable commodity in any organization. So let's have a section called Leadership Experience. Now in this one, we're going to start with the name of the organization, specifically if it's a national organization or student organization. And if it's a student organization, make sure that if you include the acronym, you at least write it out the first time so they know where you're coming from. Now we're bolding the name of the organization, italicizing your position underneath, and dates and location on the right-hand side. Then a couple of bullet points as to what you did. What did you contribute? What was that leadership role you played? Now, if you were just a part of those organizations, then you could have another section called Professional Affiliations and just list the organization, maybe put it in italics, and then the dates on the right-hand side. Now, you don't want to double list it. So if you had one under Leadership Experience, you don't have to place it again under Professional Affiliations. Also, going into the healthcare field, academia, research, you may have obtained certain licensure or certifications, and you want to indicate that. So, once again, section heading in all capital letters and underline, and then I start with the name of the certification. Basic Life Support Certification, parentheses BLS. So, I write that out, I bold it, and then I put where it came from, American Heart Association, and then I put that in italics. Then on the way in the right-hand side, you could either put the date that you need to be recertified, or if it's up to date and current, we could just put current. Now, if let's say you received a licensure for, now I'm licensed to practice medicine in the state of Florida, then you want to put on the right-hand side possibly the license number that you have on your card or the one that they provided for you, just to indicate that, for their records as they look at your CV. Now, besides getting involved in leadership opportunities, you also probably got involved in the community, especially a lot of these roles, whether it's, helping out students in higher education or in healthcare, you're kind of contributing to society. And so that's a common theme that you see in all of these settings. So what better way to showcase that passion than putting a community involvement section? Now, I'm not a fan of calling this volunteer experience because I feel it takes it down a notch. I would rather community involvement. It has a stronger meaning to it. Then we put the name of the involvement, whether it's the Reach Fair, Day for Children. We go ahead and bold that. And then, little different than the other sections, you could just put right next to it where it was located. Because they know a lot of these community involvements, you did it in a volunteer capacity, so you may want to save a little bit of space, and then on the right-hand side, the dates that you were involved in. Now, if you include a bullet point for one of these experiences, make sure you do it for all within that section. Now, mission trip is different than community involvement. I mean, one thing is spending an afternoon feeding the homeless. Another thing is going 2 to 3 weeks and actually working at a site, in Jamaica or Peru or all these different locations. That's something you took a hands-on role with. And a lot of times you were asked to do a lot of different things and wear multiple hats, which can be very valuable skill set to show within the field that you're going into. Presentations and publications. So I mentioned before, APA, MLA format. If you're not sure, make sure you check with the field of study that you're going into. Now you can see here we have a perfect example of an APA format. It's just a way of organizing things, giving it a nice look. So you can see, if you haven't seen it before, APA style, you start with the last name of the author, the first letter of his first name, then the year that it was presented on, the name of the actual presentation, and we might even put that in italicized or bold, just so it stands out a little bit. Then the name of the journal, and perhaps the specific section within that journal, the chapter and verse, so that they could be able to follow along just in case they want to see your research a little bit more closely. Now, research. You can see that we have 2 examples there, just because sometimes your research title might be a little bit long to keep in that first section, but if it's not, then we could actually start with it. You can see we have 2 different versions of this. The first one is someone that the research title maybe was a little bit long, so that they went ahead and started with their actual position, research assistant. Then on the right-hand side, we put the dates. Underneath that, we indicate the actual professor or the doctor that we were the research assistant for, and maybe his affiliation or what organization he's a part of. Then location on the right-hand side of that. Now, if you didn't include the title within that section in terms of the setup, the first bullet point really should have the title of that research so that you can provide some context to the reader. Then the second one, then you start going into what did you do within that research? What was the purpose? What were you hoping to get out of it? Now, the other example actually starts with the title of the research. So we didn't have to put research assistant at the top. We were able to start with the actual title. So they already got some context within there. So we're now winding down on some of the examples that we have for our CV. We've gone through a lot of different sections, anywhere from your clinical rotations to leadership involvement that you've had. But what if you want to put in some professional conferences that you've done, some professional development you've been a part of? Absolutely want to include this. That really shows the initiative that you've taken not only during the program, but how much you value your actual profession. So if you've been a part of a conference, you can see right here, this individual went to the 2014 American Audiology Association Conference. You want to indicate the name of the conference, maybe bold it, right next to it and italicize where it was located, and then the dates on the right-hand side. Now, if you actually presented or you networked with some key players that might be individuals that might be interviewing you today, you definitely want to include it. You might not know if that individual's like, hey, you went to this conference? Tell me more. I was actually there. Did you see this presenter? These are some things that really can get the ball rolling in terms of some conversations when you do go into the interview portion. Now, I mentioned hobbies and interests earlier. That's something you definitely want to include in your CV, because if you're applying to residency or any type of job site, they want to know the individual behind the applicancy. So now you don't want to just put, I love to read. I mean, that could be anything from reading a stop sign to actually reading a book. So you want to indicate something specific that you've read. Or if you, let's say you like to travel. See this example right here, they didn't just put travel, they put recently visited the World Cup. That gives them some more context. That might be something they provide more questions on, or you guys might have a chat after the interview. So definitely some things you want to include in your CV that could bring up more questions later on. Now, some additional headings that I may have not mentioned. And like I said, everyone is an individual and each person may have some unique experiences, which is why meeting with your career advisor can be very important in terms of structuring it or marketing in the most effective manner. But whether you've done shadowing experience, honors and awards, achievements, or any types of past projects, or like I said, something unique that we might have to create our own heading from scratch, that's more than fine, and it's a way of making us stand out and having the document read in the manner that you want it to read. So earlier I was talking about how to organize your bullet points using strong action verbs and really conveying a strong message to the reader. I even mentioned the phrase par statements. And you're probably like, what's this guy talking about? What are par statements? So I'm going to provide some context on that. Par statements, what that means is an acronym for the three components you want in your bullet points. The project, so what you were actually working on. The action, so how you're starting the document, develop, build relationships with, researched. And then the result, not just telling me what you did, but the reasoning behind it. And sometimes when you provide the reasoning behind it, you're showcasing another skill in its own, your communication skills. And specifically when going into the healthcare field, you know that you're going to have to be explaining a lot of things to patients, to upper administration, or to other doctors. So what better way to showcase that skill than through your actual bullet points themselves? The first example you can see here, this is a good way of breaking it down for yourself as you start getting used to the PAR format. Think of the project that you did. Well, I worked with community health organizations. Okay, now what did you do? Well, I actually led and managed the team. Okay, so you led and managed the team. What did this result in? Well, we actually developed an educational program. Okay, now let's put this together and maybe add some numbers if possible, to really quantify the message we're trying to get across. Now we put it all together and it reads, led and managed a team of 15 people from various community health organizations in developing an educational program to educate youth on preventable illnesses such as diabetes. That gives a strong message. It's specific, it starts with strong action verbs, and it really quantifies to the employer as to what you did and why you did it. So that last example is a great way of being able to utilize PAR statements and really be able to quantify your experiences for the employer. Now, communication, management, leadership, relationship building, these are not the only skills you want to be able to showcase. Specifically, that CVs can be used in academia and in mental health counseling. So what other skills can I provide? Critical thinking, attention to detail, even assessments. These are things that happen early on when you're working with your patients, or in academia when you're working with your students. So here's a great PAR statement that really showcases that. Mental health status of teenagers within underprivileged communities in New York. Okay, and same thing we did before. Ask ourselves, now what did we do with this project? Well, I assessed this population. Okay, now what did it result in? To identify areas of concern and develop an appropriate plan of care. Now we put this all together, it delivers once again a strong message. Assess the mental health status of teenagers within underprivileged communities in New York to identify areas of concern and develop an appropriate plan of care. So if you're going into the mental health counseling field, you're applying to, let's say, your first practicum or an opportunity directly into the field, a PAR statement like that would deliver a very strong message to that reader, how to use that skill effectively. So you heard me mention as we were developing our PAR statements to quantify it, to provide some numbers. That's just to give the full size and scale of the project that you're trying to showcase to that reader. So adding the details is kind of like that paprika garnishment right at the top of your document to really add some more life to it and give it a nice visual appeal. So you could see this example that I'm about to showcase to you. I could have researched environmental scans, or if you were the employer and you read researched and performed environmental scans and industry analysis for over 30 company sales departments, which provided management the necessary data to develop an effective plan of action and goal setting, you're more likely on the second example to be like, wow, this person has a strong knowledge base and might be a great fit for what we're trying to do with this practicum. And so that's a real way of making yourself stand out. Give the full size and scale of some of these projects. Now, other things to consider as you're writing your document: avoiding jargon, making sure that you're using strong terminology, but making sure that that terminology is universally known. And if it's certain things that you may need to write out, for example, if you put your BLS or your ACLS, make sure you write that all out. Advanced cardiac life support, basic life support, or specifically if you go to Nova Southeastern University, you don't want to just put NSU, you want to write it out, Nova Southeastern University, at least the first time, and establish that acronym so the reader can follow along. So some things to avoid on your document. So although a CV is much more comprehensive than your resume, you still want to keep in mind the length. So although a CV can go past the second page, anywhere from 3 to 5 or more pages, you want to make sure it's relevant. You don't want the reader getting to the third page and wondering, well, why are they including this information? And is this really relevant? It's a bad message to come across. So really keep that in mind. Although you have more space to include more information, ensure the information you're including is very relevant to them. Now, style changes, make sure you're consistent throughout your whole document on your font size, font style, and the way that you're bolding and italicizing your information. Also, personal information. Typically in an international CV, you include information like your age, your picture, your marital status, or even your citizenship. Unlike in the American business culture, we don't need to include that information. Unless you're applying to, let's say, a residency and they're requiring you to put a photo, that's really the only time we need to include that information. So it really shouldn't be that employer is reaching out and finding out, what's your marital status or citizenship status. So make sure that when we include our CV in American business culture, we're staying consistent to those early slides on how we had our contact information organized. And finally, irrelevant and unprofessional information. Making sure everything we're including is relevant to the employer, relevant to the reader, and ensures that it's marketing yourself in a very strong manner. So we've gone over a lot of information today on how to develop your CV, whether it was the organization, the format, or even how to quantify past experiences so it really stands out to the reader. I hope this information is helpful and you're now ready to write an effective CV for your plan of study.